And it's good to be back with malaprops, not at malaprops at this time, but with malaprops again. And just wanted to give a little personal background on my relationship to this book and to Luke. About 30 years ago, I was doing some research in the Duke Special Collections, and I came across the ledgers of William Holland Thomas. It was kind of the Walmart. It was the White Chief of the Cherokee and kind of the Walmart of Western North Carolina. But these ledgers had all the things that were traded in Thomas's 5 stores in Western North Carolina. And I was amazed when I saw there. I wasn't surprised to see ginseng, but then I saw tons and tons of black snake root, of pink root, and other herbs that he was trading for and then bundling and taking off to markets in Charleston and Savannah and places like that. And it just really got me interested to see how big this trade was and think about the implications of what it meant to life in the region. And at that time, I really thought, there's a great book in here somewhere. And then along about, I can't remember exactly when I met Luke, when he was, whether he was at Western Carolina at the time or whether it was when he was at in a PhD program at the University of Georgia, but discovered his interest in this subject, followed through on his dissertation, and now are just thrilled to see this book out that has been a long time coming, and we've had a long need for this book in Appalachian studies, which really is one of those books, and you can get carried away on this, but really does make a significant contribution to the field. So it's my pleasure to have this congregation with Luke tonight. And the first question I'll throw out there is, how did you get interested in this subject?
First of all, thank you, Dan. Thanks for doing this conversation with me. Thanks to Malaprops. Hello, people out there in virtual world. Yeah, so I first got interested in this probably 12 years ago when I was back at Western Carolina in Cullowhee working on a master's degree in Richard Starnes's class, and working on a seminar paper researching kind of post-Civil War Appalachia. I was interested in kind of the how the region kind of recovered from the Civil War, and so I had this kind of broad research question, and began looking through newspapers and other kind of sources that were available, and I saw just reference after reference to ginseng. And I knew what ginseng was. I mean, my grandmother told me about it growing up. She was born and raised in Eastern Kentucky in Pike County, and she grew up digging ginseng. Her father grew up digging ginseng, and her grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, apparently did it a lot. So I had this family connection, and it had always fascinated me. So I started seeing these references to ginseng, and so I kind of took a left turn and changed my topic. Started trying to find all the references I could to ginseng, to roots and herbs, and continued on at the University of Georgia when I was working on my doctorate, and it was a long journey. Took me a lot of different places in a lot of years, but that's how I first got interested in it.
All right, well, kind of take us into the book here and tell us what your thesis, your basic idea, your elevator speech or whatever. When you encounter people and they say, "You do what?"
That's right. I feel like I'm on my thesis defense here. So I started off with this research question. After I kind of compiled a bunch of sources, I wanted to figure out, how Appalachia became kind of the United States, most premier exporter of native medicinal plants. So by the turn of the 20th century, I had discovered that the region was supplying about 3/4 of all the plants from North America that were going into, global commercial exchanges. And so, I wanted to kind of uncover the roots of this special relationship between the region and this trade. And so, a lot of research later, I think my answer to that question is it has to do with the incredible biodiversity that exists in Appalachia. The fact that this region has some of the most diverse temperate forests in the world, and there was just so many of these medicinal plants. And combined with, locals' knowledge of these plants, their uses of these plants, and the custom of the commons, which basically, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later, but the commons enabled, people to have access to the forest to harvest kind of whatever they found growing. So I think some of those factors I traced through the book helped me research this question, helped put Appalachia on the map, and made them the most important kind of region in terms of wild medicinal plant gathering for the commercial market.
Well, talk a little bit about, because I think people may have some familiarity with ginseng.
Yeah.
And market, and you still occasionally, I know, I remember one place between Silva and Cullowhee that would have a sign out at certain parts of the year that announced that they were buying ginseng. And there are places in Western North Carolina where you can still go and see that. But talk about some of the other medicinal herbs and also what these were used for. I think I know my students seem to have a fascination with traditional herbal medicine, and so of course that was the heart and soul of medicine at this back in the 19th century. So talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, root digging in Appalachia goes back, to the Cherokee, and beyond. I mean, I started the book primarily with ginseng in the early 18th century when it first becomes kind of a commodity of exchange. And ginseng, if you don't know, is a herbaceous perennial herb that grows, in the forest. Reaches about 18 inches high at its height. It has leaves as many as 4. I've never seen a 5-prong, but they're out there. But each leaf is comprised of 5 little leaflets. And if you didn't know what you're looking for, you'd walk right by it, in the woods. I mean, it took me a while to learn how to identify it and find it. But this plant began being traded from Appalachia in small quantities in the mid 18th century. I think there was a series of ginseng booms that started up in Quebec. That's kind of where the trade started back in the 1720s. And a group of Jesuits who were operating all around the world at that time kind of discovered that the American species of ginseng, Panax cingifolium, could be sold to Asia, to China specifically, as something of a substitute for the Asian ginseng, which is Panax ginseng. And these Jesuits kind of, by communicating amongst themselves, kind of figured out like this was, they thought it was basically the same plant. And so they started this, limited trade that quickly grew into a boom. And that was in the 1730s and 40s. And then by the 1780s, the trade had spread down into the Ohio Valley. And so there was a big boom right after the American Revolution as kind of, white American settlers were pushing into the Ohio Valley and finding just tons. I mean, there must have been just tons of ginseng. I mean, people were talking about digging 40 to 60 pounds of ginseng a day, which to me, I mean, it sounds like it was just covered the floor of these forests if you could dig that much. So, so the Ohio Valley had a big boom in the 1780s, and it comes really down to the Southern Appalachians in the 1780s, 1790s, around the turn of the 19th century. And, people moving into these areas who might not have had much cash, might not have been able to kind of start a farm and get crops in the ground. I mean, they could find this root growing, and they harvested it, and thousands and thousands of pounds of it. And some of these early ledger books I looked at, these people are bringing it in and trading it for all kinds of stuff, and we can talk about that trade a little bit more. So ginseng was, and to a limited extent, pink root and some other forms of snake root were kind of the first commercial roots that made it into kind of global markets from Appalachia. But as Dan mentioned, in the 1840s, some of these kind of changes in American medicine opened up space for more Native American plants to be manufactured into medicines. So this is the time period in which kind of the pharmaceutical industry was just getting going. The patent medicine industry was becoming increasingly popular, reaching heights of popularity in the late 19th century. And so some of these entrepreneurs specifically in Western North Carolina started creating supply chains that went into the forests of North Carolina and brought it all the way up to these patent medicine manufacturers, these pharmaceutical companies, primarily in the northeastern United States and in the Midwest. And so dozens of new plants became marketable, and they were, there was, Mayapple was a big one, was an important one, and that was used as a purgative, basically to induce diarrhea. And this is the age of humoral theory, right? Where the purpose of medicine was to balance the humors and bleed people and sweat people and make them throw up and all these kind of things. So Mayapple was kind of used in that sense. You had pink root, which was used as a vermifuge, which got rid of intestinal worms. You had various forms of snake root, Virginia snake root, Seneca snake root. Virginia snake root was used to treat typhoid fevers. Seneca snake root was used as a diaphoretic, made people sweat, and used for like lung ailments. Let's see. Pink lady slipper was a big tradable commodity. It was used as a nervine, basically to kind of treat headaches, to help people sleep and that sort of thing. But that just scratches the surface. There were literally dozens, and then later on hundreds of different plants that had, that in the use of these plants did kind of shift over time depending on some of these medical theories that came out. But by the late 19th century, yeah, there were hundreds of them using. So I could keep talking about that, Dan.
Well, talk a little bit about the supply chains from the individual root diggers and the importance of that to the subsistence economy, then to in particular that end of it, and then the local store owners, the William Holland Thomases and folks like that who are buying this, and what role these herbs played in the economic life of the region.
Sure, yeah. So it definitely changes over time. I mentioned that when white European settlers kind of first move into the Appalachian region, I mean the sources that I've looked at, and which included a lot of business records, included people who were trading these things were pretty well off landholders. There was one store I looked at in West Virginia in which at least 80% of the income brought into the store was in ginseng, and so these people were using ginseng to buy everything from to barter for anything from saddles to plow points to knives to gunpowder to coffee was a big one. They used a lot of folks use ginseng to pay taxes. That was kind of the one thing that mountain folks really needed cash for, and ginseng kind of provided that. There was evidence that people purchased land with it, that they settled court disputes with ginseng. It was depending on the community, it was the economic life of some of these stores. And when kind of the first towns start opening up on the Ohio River, places like Wheeling and Marietta, the merchants, the first merchants to kind of move into that region were using ginseng as a currency. Their fortunes pretty much depended on ginseng. So it was pretty central to the economic life early on in these early European communities or Euro-American communities in the Trans-Appalachian region. Now that kind of changes a bit over time. After the Civil War, the kind of dynamics of this trade and the role it played in local communities is just it's kind of thrown up in the air. First of all, by that time, the trade was primarily confined to folks who were landless, who were land poor, who were kind of on the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So they were using it to, there were kind of two different types of diggers at the time. There were the part-time diggers, people that tried to just harvest it in their spare time while they were working their farm and get some extra stuff. But then there were after the war there were full-time diggers who that's all they did, and so they would use it to purchase corn, meal, coffee, sugar, potatoes, things that they could have grown on a farm, but they were full-time diggers. So after the war, it really kind of was something of a social safety net for those people who didn't have any other means of making any money, which is kind of the way it is today. In areas of high unemployment, of unstable employment in coal country, for example, there is a correlation now between high unemployment and ginseng digging.
We'll talk about that in connection with this, how your work really builds on the work of Kathy Newfont and her work on the commons in her book Blue Ridge Commons. How does the commons and changing notions of the commons figure into your story?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big takeaways I think from my book. And the story of root and herb digging is the story of the forest commons. These roots and herbs were dug. They weren't raised in private gardens. They by and large weren't dug on someone's private property. They were dug on the mountainsides. And Kathy Newfont kind of has focused our attention on this term forest commons, and I think it's a good term to use. It's unlike the English commons. It wasn't inscribed in law. It wasn't kind of formalized in any way, but it was just through custom and through ongoing negotiations between landowners and forest users. The forested mountainsides were pretty much open for anyone in the community to use. It was widely accepted that these plants were property of the harvester rather than the landowner on whose land they grew. So, if you found ginseng growing out in the wild, you could dig it. There was no questions asked. Prior to the 1880s, 1890s. So, the commons it's a fascinating kind of social institution that Kathy has brought Kathy's book Blue Ridge Commons has shed some really important light on. People like Mary Hufford, a folklorist, who's also written about it. But it's hard to write about. It's hard to kind of get at that institution because it wasn't like I said, it wasn't formalized in law. It wasn't, written about. People didn't talk about it very much. It was just something people did, So I think looking at the root trade can give us some idea of how the commons function, how it worked a little bit. And I think roots and herbs at various points in Appalachian history throughout the 19th century really was one of the most important commons commodities that you could find and then sell and make money on. So the commons kind of enabled landless people, squatters, people who maybe not own land but live next to a bunch of acreage that was owned maybe by someone back in Boston or Charleston or something like that, and they could go out there and not only get what they needed to live, like some gather food, edibles, firewood, honey, feathers, but also things that they could sell. Furs and skins, of course, are kind of the other really important commodity that came out of the forest commons. But ginseng and roots kind of overtook skins and furs by the mid 19th century as kind of the most important commercial articles to come out of the forest commons. So yeah, I mean, I could talk more about the commons if you want, Dan. That would.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about how notions changed. Particularly, when you get, ginseng becomes relatively scarce at times, and I imagine the same thing with some of these other herbs as right. Demand increases. Does that because we kind of look at commons and say, oh, how cooperative, how democratic, does it become much more competitive, and do people, look for ways to close the commons, to control their supply of ginseng and other herbs? Right.
Yeah. So how the commons functioned is kind of the holy grail, of common studies. And in the past, it's really, it's just really hard to get at, but my book attempts to get at it. And, I think if you've heard of the commons, you probably are familiar with Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, right? Which was an article that came out in the 60s that really kind of influenced the way people thought about the commons. And essentially he argues that commons are kind of destined to collapse because commons users lack any kind of incentive to limit their use of the commons. So they lack some sort of conservation ethics. So they just, overharvest and dig things out and hunt things out and, overgraze and that sort of thing. So, since then, people have complicated that idea. They've challenged Hardin and said, you're not taking into consideration various cultural factors and various ways that communities have cooperated to limit harvests. So there's a really interesting debate over, what happens to commons resources and what kind of commons regimes have been successful. I'll say that, there was always tension in the root digging commons between those who were trying to conserve, trying to steward, these plants in the wild, and those who were eager to exploit it. They were looking for a short-term kind of, profit. So there's always that tension, and so there was never some perfect time when, the commons were successfully, managed for sustained yield in the 19th century. But you do see evidences of people trying. People wrote in. I found sources in which people were saying, yeah, I replant the seeds, every time I dig a plant up, I replant it, and I only dig, a quarter or a half or whatever of the patch that I find. There were people that actually said that they do these things. But I've also found store ledgers that basically only trade ginseng in the fall season. It was kind of remarkable. There's this one store ledger that I have like 10 years worth of records for, and every year he never took any green ginseng before September. And September in the fall is when ginseng goes to seed, right? Grows berries and goes to seed, so you can replant the berries. And so you must have to limit it to the fall in order to kind of, protect these populations. And in this one community, at this one store, butcher store, right, there seems to have been a season. So, I'm not sure what was going on there exactly, but it does kind of suggest that, that there was something at work there, that they were able to kind of able to at least limit those harvests to the fall, which was not the case for all the ledgers I examined, especially the early ones and the later ones when people were trading at green at all times of the year. So there were people that were trying, but there was always tension over the commons too. I mean, it was not some democratic cooperative society in which everybody just agreed or on how to use it. There was always these tensions, and after the Civil War, particularly, it really bubbled up. Those tensions did, and this had to do with just the greater pressure on the forest commons. People digging more roots. These full-time diggers now who don't have any other means of subsistence, so they're digging as much as they can. You had people from outside the region, coming into the mountains to find ginseng because they had heard, that during this time of deep economic depression, that there was this herb in the mountains, that you could still find. So it attracted a lot of outsiders. And then you start to see kind of, quibbles over the commons. You see some laws introduced saying that, we're going to require people to, get permission from the landowner before they dig. You start to see seasons being imposed by the state. And so after the Civil War, you just kind of see this renegotiation of common rights, ultimately leading to, significant weakening of it. And by the 20th century, in most areas of Appalachia, you couldn't just assume the right to dig ginseng wherever you found it growing. There was a legal regime now that protected them.
Well, you talked about using store ledgers, and one of the great strengths of your book, I think, is a creative use of source material. Can you talk about your sources and the types of things that you found, again, which no one else had really used knowledge? So.
Yeah, it was a journey. I started off, okay. I'm going to tell a little story that gets at the last part of the book. So when I first got into this topic, I discovered some of these newspaper writings of sang diggers. They call them sang diggers or sangers, which is a shortening of ginseng. And the stories they were writing about, how they depicted these ginseng diggers was just, you probably all know about, mountaineer Appalachian stereotypes, hillbilly stereotypes. The sang diggers were the most backward of all the the mountaineers. They didn't believe in law. They didn't believe in private property. They didn't believe in marriage, right? They stole and plundered. They ate snakes and owls and crows, just really fantastic stuff. But, as an Appalachian historian, I'm like that, I'm reading this with a big, a lot of skepticism, a healthy dose of skepticism. But, I wanted to kind of figure out the reality behind it. Like, my great grandfather dug ginseng. This doesn't sound like him, so I started trying to, it took a couple of years, just kind of poking around in places to figure out where am I going to find, sources that can actually speak to the reality of this situation. And, there wasn't much. So I kind of had a hunch that if there was as much ginseng being traded as some of these people claimed, it was going to appear in the records of the country stores where they would take it in and barter it. And so I began looking at country store ledgers, these old 150-year-old ledgers that have all the records of what was purchased, what was bartered at these country stores, what was used to purchase it. And I basically digitized them all, put them all in a spreadsheet. And it took it took a lot of evening mindless, mind-numbing work to do all that. But I ended up collecting about 30, between 30 and 40, I can't remember the exact number, of these different letters from different stores from around the region. Some of them were in university archives, some of them were in local libraries, some of them were in state archives, some of them were in local history museums, and some of them were even in just old country stores that still had records going back 100 years. So I just kind of traveled around the region collecting these old ledgers, and I was able to kind of piece together at least a lot of suggestive evidence from these ledgers. But it was fun. I was hunting ginseng in the archives, I guess.
And then you also went into the records of some of the larger pharmaceutical companies at the time as well. Is that correct?
Yes. So interestingly, one of the big time pharmaceutical manufacturers in the 1830s and 40s and into the 1850s were the Shakers, the Shaker communities up in the Northeast and Midwest. And a guy by the name of Calvin Coles, he was a merchant in northwestern North Carolina, Wilkesboro area. His business records, had a lot of shipments going to these Shakers. And so I went up to the winter tour garden and archives up in Delaware, where they have all the Shaker materials you ever want, and look through all their ledgers and stuff. So there were several that I wanted to look at. I didn't get a chance to do it, but I did look at a few of those larger ones.
Good. Well, research can be mind-numbing in many cases, but tell us about some exciting days in the archives of things you found that were particularly interesting or changed the way that you thought about your project and you or whatever made you laugh or
oh man, I mean there was a lot of strikeouts. I mean, I would travel to Raleigh and spend a week looking at certain collections and really not find anything, which is part of the deal, when you're kind of creating a new research landscape. Really, it's sometimes you strike out, but I'd say that the turning point came when I found Calvin Coles's records, who is housed at part of it's in Raleigh at the State Archives, part of it is at UNC, and this was after I'd several ledgers worth that I didn't really find anything. There wasn't a lot of bartering going on. Some of the ledgers I couldn't even read. Some of them they were dealing entirely in cash, so it didn't really tell me what people were using. But I got Calvin Coles's books, found his kind of his root and herb books as it was written down, and it was like Christmas. I mean, every page filled with mayapple, ginseng, wild ginger, you name it. So, and not only was it documenting what people brought in, but also where it was going. And one of the interesting things I found, I think early on, was that he was buying a lot of roots and herbs from a guy named Henry Taylor, who was a merchant in Valley Crucis, Watauga County, and he was the founder of the Mast General Store. So he would go on later to team up with William Mast, but he kind of created the store in Valley Crucis that would later become kind of the Mast General. So they call him Uncle Henry. Uncle Henry would bring a whole wagon load of roots and herbs down the mountain at least twice a year, in the 1840s and 50s to Calvin Coles, who would then take it up to the Shakers. So that was actually pretty cool. That might have been the highlight of my research. I mean, there was a lot of them. I mean, I think finding these kind of full-time sang diggers was really interesting too, because you hear about them, people wrote about them, you see references to them in newspapers, but I was able to kind of find in these store ledgers from West Virginia, actually like find people that, brought in 200 pounds of ginseng in the fall and used that for their, really their entire purchases in the fall, and creating a line of credit that would take them through the winter. So these were the singers, that the people were writing about. But I highly doubt that they ate snakes and owls and that sort of stuff. Refused to get married and that sort of thing. But
hard to see the connection there. But
yeah, right.
Other than that, these are poor people, and these are the kinds of things that we think poor people do.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, historians are bad to ask this question, but of each other and of our students, but talk about the significance of what you found in this book.
Yeah. I think, one of, as you mentioned, I think Appalachian historians in the general public, maybe even, knows that mountain people dig roots and herbs, and know that they did it in the past, right? Especially if you're from the region, you have somebody in your family that, had dug ginseng or dug some sort of roots and herbs, but I think my book really tries to historicize it, tries to figure out how that kind of that activity contributed to these this seasonal subsistence cycles in the mountains, and how that kind of changed over time, because the opening up of markets is a global thing, and by looking at these global markets for ginseng and these other medicinal plants, you can kind of help give a little form to these trades, in the woods. One of the big misconceptions of mountain people, especially in the 19th century, right, is that they were entirely isolated from the world, right? They were walled off by the mountains and developed their own peculiar habits and customs and that sort of thing. And I think the one of the reasons I think my book is important is that it points out that even these people that were, maybe the poorest of the poor in the mountains, and maybe even the most isolated, maybe the people that live deepest in the forest, were still contributing to these global networks of exchange. They were still, fueling markets in Asia. They actually helped open up trade relationships between the United States and China back in the 1780s. So they played a role in these supply chains. So so I think that's one of the reasons why it's significant.
All right. Well, and I'm sure folks out there listening want to know, other than Mayapple giving you diarrhea, probably for sure, what of these herbs work?
Oh man.
There is such a fascination, particularly in Asheville, for sure, in medicinal herbs. So
you're gonna hate this answer, but I'm not an herbalist. I wouldn't feel comfortable telling people how to use various herbs. I know a lot of herbs that they traded back then are still used today, from yellow root, to, bloodroot. People use it every now and then to clear up kind of warts. That's for one reason. I might have to leave it to somebody else to dispense medical advice about these plants. I'm a historian, as we like to say. That's not my area. But there are. Some of these plants, obviously are still used. But consult your local herbalist to learn a little bit more about it.
I'm sure Malaprops has several books on this.
I'm sure.
So patronize them. So
Mayapple was probably the one that lasted the longest in the pharmacopoeia. it remained in there through the 1940s and 50s before it was kind of removed. But yeah, I mean, I could, maybe I should talk a little bit about how it, what happened to the trade. I mean, because the ginseng trade really takes a nosedive, by the 1890s, the turn of the 20th century. It declines quite a bit. Exports are, decline by more than half. Prices for it kind of shoot up. You can start to see that this boom, post-Civil War boom, really starts to take its toll, and it retreats, I guess, further back in the mountains. Right? It doesn't disappear, but it retreats, and it remained kind of low until about the 1960s, 1970s, and then the exports start kind of climbing back up again. So ginseng digging obviously is still around, it's still there, although it's very, very restricted now. I mean, the ginseng populations are not doing that well. I mean, you can't dig ginseng in a national forest now. There's a moratorium because to help these plants rebound. But the other plants, the other kind of botanical drug trade, that also takes a nosedive after World War II. So after World War II, American medicine kind of moves away from, plant-based medicine, and it had always been a portion of American medicine. It never dominated kind of pharmaceutical, but it was a big portion of it. But after World War II, these kind of mineral-based drugs, chemically synthesized drugs kind of take over the market, and actual plants, physical plants, they are no longer really needed. And so they are, it grinds to a halt really in the 1940s and 50s for the most part. But then there was a revival in the 70s, due to the natural foods and natural medicine movements, and now there are limited markets out there available. But not as much, right? Not as much as there was in the late 19th century, for sure.
All right. Well, let me just take a personal note here and ask you a totally unrelated question. Luke has the unusual distinction of being the finest football place kicker in the historical profession. So describe the moment when you kicked the winning field goal against the University of Georgia, and which almost cost you, as I understand it, a place in the PhD program at the University of Georgia when Jim Cobb wanted to blackball you because of that.
That is true story. True story. Almost didn't get in. And I had to kind of, keep my identity a little secret while I was on campus there. But yeah, it was back in 1999, whole different chapter of my life here. It was in Atlanta, overtime. Kicked the game winner against Georgia and defeated them, and that was the last time we've beaten Georgia in Atlanta, unfortunately. But yeah, it was quite the thrill, I gotta say.
Well, I hope the coming out of this book and I know the positive response that's going to be out there from readers and historians and others. Hopefully that'll be as big a thrill as that was.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, we'll turn it over to Patricia for questions from our listeners.
Well, if you hear something rumbling in the background, it's not my stomach. It is the thunder that has rolled into the area. So just heads up, everybody, if you're wondering what's going on there. And Luke, even though I thought I did a wonderful rehearsal, I think I mispronounced your last name, and it should be Manget and not what I said, which was, the Southerner came right out. The gal from the Piedmont jumped out and just said it the way she kind of thought it was. So
it's okay. That's okay. It's better than Magnet or Manget. I get it all. So.
All right, that makes me feel better because I thought, I really did my best there, but then the Southerner jumped out. So anyway, kind of fitting, but nonetheless, thank you for being so gracious. Let me pose a few questions to you, if I may. The first one is from Carolyn Carlson. Jay, how much did ginseng sell for example, per pound? And how does that compare to today? Lucrative or not?
Yes, good question. Hi, Carolyn. Carolyn's my aunt. Yes, that's a good question. In the early 19th century, it sold for about 25 cents a pound. By the late 19th century, it was selling, anywhere from 60 cents a pound in the 1860s to $4 a pound in the 1890s. It was quite lucrative. I mean, when John Muir traveled through the Southern Mountains in 1867, he basically noted that the common laborers made about $10 a month. So if you could dig up 20 pounds of ginseng, or maybe 20, I'm not a math person, but 20 pounds of ginseng is about would be roughly the same as a month's worth of hard labor. So it was pretty lucrative. And today it fetches, I think, $700-800 a pound. I think it was up to $1,000 a pound a few years ago. So yeah, it's lucrative, and it has always been the most lucrative herb. None of the other medicinal herbs really compared to ginseng's value. Good question.
And thank you, Auntie, for that question. I love any story that is about a PhD or a dissertation being in jeopardy, because that's the stuff of legend. So I want to personally salute you for getting that in there. That's really good. You have another person with your last name posing questions and making comments. And so now that I think I can say it correctly, Manget, Fred, you may know.
He's my uncle. This is just my family watching there.
Family, where would we be without family? So first of all, since I mentioned that dissertation, his question was, first question was, how did setting scoring records and being elected to the Georgia Tech Football Hall of Fame inform your ginseng research? 2 exclamation points there, no question mark. So I have to believe, Uncle Fred, that was a rhetorical question. So
sounds like Uncle Fred.
Fred, we're on to you. We think you have jumped in the chat and done a little disturbing over there. Now,
and the answer is it informed it a lot.
So that was the academic answer. That's a lot. Right. That's how we like them. And then Uncle Fred's next question was, what was ginseng used for here and in Asia? And you kind of touched on that some. And without giving medical advice, which I know you're a doctor, but not that kind of doctor, as we like to say, 3 doctors in the house. So go ahead and tackle that one for us, if you could, Luke.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so one interesting thing is that it wasn't widely used in the United States. Mountain, there was always kind of anecdotes about mountain people chewing it or using it here and there, but from what I've gathered, it was far more valuable as a commodity than as a medicine. So the vast majority of it was just sold. American medicine was not very conducive to ginseng in the 19th century. As I mentioned, this, humoral theory still dominated. People believe that in a good medicine, made you vomit or, sweat profusely, or, they used mercury, for goodness sake. So ginseng was too mild, right? So it wasn't active enough. It wasn't strong enough. It wasn't powerful. They said, so it never really caught on, right, in the botanical drug trade in the United States. That, and there was also quite a bit of anti-Chinese racism that and prejudice that I think kind of wrote ginseng off as some sort of superstition, but the Chinese, however, had been using it for thousands of years. And of course, they were using Asian ginseng, which has kind of more of a warming stimulant effect on the body, whereas American ginseng has more of like a cooling, calming effect on it. Studies are still being done on what ginseng could be used for. I mean, there's growing number of studies that say that it's useful for certain things, like diabetes. Some people use it for diabetes, and to calm the mind. But the Chinese had long used it in their kind of medicine of harmony to balance the yin and the yang, right? So it was the cooling that cooled the yin, right? That medicine that ginseng was used for is also used as an aphrodisiac and a general tonic. I mean, it was a panacea. I mean, in their medicine, it essentially addressed a lot of issues.
I really can't remember another author event where I've heard both the word vomit and diarrhea in 1 hour. You know what? That's ginseng for you, folks. There you go. Or maybe that has to do with the dissertation.
That's right.
Right. So as we are kind of thinking about the conclusion here, Luke, as you did so much research, and Dan's been great at talking to you about how you did it. If you were, for the lay person, what books helped you figure out how you were going to shape this story, or is there a go-to book in history, or in some way, what were your inspirations? Or you could either go the other way, what not to do's?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I owe a lot of debts to a lot of people. And I think, Catherine Newfont, right, is kind of right up there. Her Blue Ridge Commons kind of helped pave the way in a lot of ways and focus Appalachian scholars on this question of the commons. So I think I think it might not be too much of a stretch to say that if it weren't for her book, I would have just written this book about ginseng and ginseng digging, like some people had in the past. Just people dug it and then focusing on the uses of it, focusing on the big markets for it. But I think this language of the commons, the fact in the way she kind of let us think about it, helped me frame the story a little better. Right, it allowed me to kind of get into the forest and really explore kind of how root digging and herb gathering shape, land use, social relations, and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of other folks. Don Davis, who wrote Where There Are Mountains, this environmental history of Appalachia, was incredibly influential. Ron Eller, my advisor, John Insco. I don't even know really where else to begin on who to thank here, but Blue Ridge Commons, if you haven't read it, you should get that one too, in addition to Ginseng Diggers.
And then when I was also kind of thinking about all of the work you've done, are you working on something else? Is there an idea germinating, pun intended?
Well, I'm digging into a couple of topics now. I have a couple different ways I could go, but I do think that more exploration of the historical American commons is needed. There's a lot of secondary stuff on little pockets of resistance here, or resistance to enclosure here, but I think it'd be worthwhile to think in terms of a general history, a survey, right? Like a synthesis of these works on kind of the rise and fall of the American commons. But I'm not, I'm going to work towards that idea, and we'll see where it goes. But that might be the next thing.
Well, wonderful. I want to let you make any concluding remarks. No pressure. This is not an Academy Award acceptance speech, so you don't have to thank everybody. You can, take some deep cleansing breaths. Thank Dan and me if you want to, and take the pressure off yourselves, and Stephanie too. But
I think I will do that.
and your aunt and uncle.
Yes. Thank you, Carolyn, Fred. And thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. Dan's been great through this whole process, just in terms of encouragement, support. Not to mention his book, The Great Smokies, right, which was another big influence too. Yeah, thanks to Malaprops. I really appreciate this opportunity. Hope to get into the store at some point in the near future. And I would like to, I don't know if he's watching or not, but my advisor, John Insco, I mean, he's the greatest person in the world, greatest scholar, greatest man, greatest mentor, super helpful and very positive, just a nice guy. And he's I hope he's doing well. His health isn't the best right now. So I'm thinking about him, but thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Stephanie.
We appreciate you so much. Thank you, Luke. And we're so glad you had this great conversation with Dan. It's always a pleasure to see Dan and to learn more about ginseng. And Luke, thank you for enlightening us and introducing us to this story. We've been listening to a fantastic conversation this evening with Luke Manget, and his book is Ginseng Diggers. And he's been in conversation with Dan Pierce. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And also Luke is using his new microphone, which like 8 of us are going to buy soon. So thank you all and have a great evening.